One of the most sought after cameras in recent memory is the Fujifilm X100V. Unfortunately, it's become as rare as rocking horse teeth. Or hen's shit, I forget how the analogy goes. Fuji have been struggling to keep up with demand, which has made the price soar on the second-hand market, with copies of the X100V selling up to £2,000, but the average price being around £1,500. To put that into perspective, I bought the X100V a few years ago and paid £900 for it in mint condition. So are there any cheaper alternatives you could get? You could try a previous model of the X100 series, but those still fetch a decent price to this day. So in this video, I'm putting the lesser known Fuji X10 through its paces to see how well it stacks up against the cool kids camera. I bought my X10 on eBay for a measly £70. The going rate for these cameras is around the 250 mark, so it was definitely a bargain, if you ignore the fact that the camera was being sold as spares and had every chance of never working again. But apart from that, it was a complete bargain to buy a non-functioning camera for less than £100. Obviously, I decided to take the risk and see if I could fix the thing, because if I could, then I've got the camera for about a quarter of its value, which just so happens to be the exact amount my employers are getting me for. Anyway, upon fitting the brand new battery to see what's going on, there was nothing happening with the screen at all, which is a good start. So I popped the hood, as the cool dudes on my street that chase me with their cars would say, and start stripping it down to continue troubleshooting. It looked like there was some kind of corrosion on this ribbon cable and the back of the screen, which could have been caused by dropping the whole thing in the water during someone's weird bathroom livestream, or there's just been some leak of some kind inside the camera. Anyway, your favourite internet bad boy decided to live dangerously and chanced getting a new screen sent out for £20. And after putting it all back together, it worked. And yes, that was Helen. And no, she's not a man with big pendulous testicles. Just emasculating, domineering, throaty burps. I wonder what being with a feminine woman is like. Moment of truth. Yes, mate.
Yes, mate.
Yes, mate. It's working.
Is it vibing?
Oh, don't fucking say, is it vibing, you twat? Fucking vibe. Cram your vibe up your anus. So, with the camera fixed up and ready to go out vibing, or whatever the kids are saying this week, we took it out for a stroll to see how it measures up against the X100V. Whoa, whoa, whoa! What the hell are you doing? While you do have full manual controls on the X10, and all the professional features you'd expect on a high-grade camera, it doesn't quite have the dials and custom buttons to make it easy to key everything in. There's no Q menu, for instance, and no aperture or focus ring due to the weird zoom ring that also turns the camera on as well as controls the focal length. You'll notice that I'm using the screen to compose the shots where I would normally use the EVF 95% of the time. But while there is a viewfinder on this camera, it's a tunnel style optical viewfinder with no electronics whatsoever, making it pretty useless for my style of photography. I did notice that the parallax error was nicely corrected though, so what you see through the glass is what you also see on the back of the screen. Speaking of the screen, it's fixed and doesn't tilt. I've been spoiled in all these years that we've had tilting screens and have grown accustomed to them, so I did find it difficult to get the look I wanted in camera due to the screen sometimes being difficult to see. But for its few flaws, it does pack a hell of a lot of features into such a small body. You can shoot RAW and manually control focus on the front here, where we'll also find the f2 to 2.8 zoom lens with its 35mm equivalent focal range of 28 to 112mm, which is an impressive focal and aperture range, but you shouldn't get too excited, as the only reason a lens of those stats can fit in such a small form is due to the tiny 2/3 of an inch EXR CMOS sensor. On top we'll find the pop-up flash and hot shoe mount, along with the exposure comp and PASM ring. The build quality feels solid, if not a tiny bit fiddly due to its small size, but I'd be happy to rely on this as my main camera if I was just starting out in serious photography. There's a cool macro mode you can mess about with too, which seems to be quite common on these cameras with smaller sensors. Throughout my testing, I found that detail, sharpness and chromatic aberration were well controlled and yielded perfectly usable shots throughout the entire focal length. Although it's worth noting that a quick online search shows that the RAW files do suffer heavily from barrel distortion at the wide end, and they would need to be corrected in post. Personally, I don't edit RAW files, so it wasn't an issue for me. If we're comparing these two cameras, then it makes sense to get some stats side by side. The main differences of the cameras are the sensor sizes, and the X100V having a much bigger APS-C size sensor, which will capture more light and allow for better low light performance, and give us faster shutter speeds. The small sensor does allow the X10 to pack a big zoom range with a wide aperture though, compared to the X100V's fixed focal length. The X100V has a much more usable viewfinder that shows some details electronically, or you can just use it as a tunnel viewfinder if you want to. There's no stabilisation with it though, unlike the X10 which has optical image stabilisation. But the V does have a tilting screen which is more difficult to kick than crack once you've used one. Ultimately it's going to be down to preference, but the clincher for me would be that sensor size. 26 megapixels is enough to crop a little in post, and it just allows for way more detailed images and more usability in different scenarios. The X10 is no slouch either, and whilst it's an old camera at this point, it's very impressive considering its price range. Another note about the small sensor is that you'll struggle to get any kind of bokeh and subject separation, even with the huge zoom range and wide aperture. Both cameras, in classic Fuji style, do allow you to do some work to your JPEGs to get the look that you want straight out of camera. Although the X100V has way more options here with film simulations alone. But the X10 still allows you to edit the highlights, the shadows, noise reduction, colour levels, even edit the white balance, red and blue levels, which makes more of a difference to your look than you might initially think. This matters to me a great deal personally, as I don't edit the RAWs, I just want to get the shots right straight out of camera. But I do prefer the UI on the X100V, and the fact that there's simply more options for customising the look of your image, as well as the functionality of the camera itself. Plus you can't see the live results as easily on the X10 without an EVF to look through while you're in the field. And since I last made a video, we've acquired a cat somehow. The short version is he's called Lucy because we thought he was a girl, and the name sounded feminine, but is actually short for Lucifer. Anyway, we've since found out he's a boy, which works out better being named after the devil. But now our family's hounding us to change his name to something more masculine. So now, whenever they ask, we just tell them he's called Smeggy. Anyhow, Lucy is going to help me test the X10 further and be my model for some portraiture shots, because animals are notoriously easy to work with, and cats are notoriously obedient and should definitely be easy to photograph. Exposure can be a pig to nail, again due to not having a tilting screen. Even using the metering modes accurately doesn't always yield you the results you want. For instance, I used centre spot metering here to expose the highlights, but it was too dark. So I tried average metering and instead got a totally overblown shot. It's a contrasty shot in all fairness, but we're really seeing the limitations of a small sensor and lack of dynamic range here. The histogram can help, but there's also weird frame skips when you use the autofocus, and that just won't work with fast moving subjects like kids or animals. I thought I'd try the flash so that I could up the shutter and expose correctly. Worked quite nicely actually, but this killed the X10's tiny battery in no time. The flash allows you to compensate up to 2/3 of a stop, and actually showed a nice balance of exposure and high shutter speed here. I don't normally like to use the flash on cameras, but this one actually seemed to be quite a tasteful one that's not too offensive, probably due to its small size. The smaller it is, the less offensive it is when you use it in public after all. So is the X10 worth picking up over the X100V? Well, if you can stomach the downsides of it, like the lack of tilting screen, the much smaller sensor size and so forth, then yeah, absolutely. It's a superb camera to cut your teeth on when you're first getting into higher level photography. I'm not happy with any of the shots I got on this camera, but I've come to see it as baby's first pro level camera. Regardless, it's impressive what you can do with such a small camera, and I think it's definitely worth picking up if you're on a budget. You can learn all the technicalities of photography on this, like shooting and editing RAW, using the histogram and deciding whether or not to shoot in aperture priority or shutter priority and seeing what different effects you can get with those. Plus the X10 costs a fraction of the X100V anyway, which is its main selling point, so you should go for it. I'm sure the next X100 would be announced as soon as you bought the V anyway.